Hello and welcome to this online class on the 1850 Compromise. This topic is going to look at the period roughly from 1820 through to 1850, and this topic is very much linked to what your next assessment option is, which is the question on the causes of the American Civil War. This conflict, this 4-year conflict that will eventually occur between the Southern Confederacy and the Northern United States or Union. And this topic really is about this first part of this topic, what we're going to call the increase in sectional tension leading to the 1850 Compromise. This topic is really about this divide that emerges between the North and the South, roughly from 1819, 1820 through until 1850. And then there will be a second online lecture which will cover the years 1850 to 1861, which we will refer to as the causes of the American Civil War. But both of these topics are linked, and you can only understand the Civil War question if you know these kind of earlier examples of tension that prevailed within the United States, going, as I said, as far back into 1820. So the 1850 Compromise that we're going to focus on today was largely centred on this issue of slavery, or more precisely, slavery expansion, and then the follow-up lecture, the causes of the Civil War, which has obviously been hotly debated over the years. That is also about slavery and its extension into Western territories. And because of that, this topic is also relevant or related to the previous topic that we studied, which was westward expansion. So when you studied westward expansion and you looked at all of these different reasons and motivations for people in the East going west, what we did not necessarily do, or what you did not necessarily do, was explore the question, did Southerners take their slaves with them when they went into the West? And the answer to that question is sometimes. So for example, if you take the situation in California with the gold rush, now and again you would get the odd slave owner who would take a slave, but they are a very, very small proportion of those who went west. Where slaves did go west was primarily in Texas, and here we have the beginning of a slave holding society, which you would have picked up on when you examined this part of the westward expansion class. We will talk a little bit more about Texas today. So with westward expansion we do have migration, but very little of it is the expansion or extension of slavery. However, that does not mean that Southerners in the United States and Southern politicians, that does not mean that they do not want further slave states in the West where slavery could expand and thrive and live without maybe extending or expanding. There was a fear among some Southerners, some Southern politicians and plantation owners, that slavery could possibly die out in a generation's time. It had to be more dynamic, it had to be constantly on the move, was their interpretation. So I think it's important to think about this period that we're going to look at right up until 1861 with the within the context of social, economic and geographical changes that are taking place in the United States. And the question is, with all of that happening, where does slavery and slavery expansion fit in? So that's what we're going to touch on today, and we're going to look at this idea of, does some of these questions that I've listed here, does some of these ideas or arguments, do they play a long-term part? Do they contribute to the outbreak of the American Civil War? So slavery, just by existing in itself, is enough to divide the nation, but the nation had kind of accepted it because most Northerners believed that eventually slavery would come to an end naturally. Some Southerners may have believed that as well. There was also the view that maybe slaves over time would be freed by their slave owner. This is known as the process of manumission. What actually happens during the period 1800 to 1860 as slavery becomes more and more entrenched, right, as you are aware of through your study of the topic of slavery. And what you actually get is Southerners justifying the existence of slavery for their own purposes and for their own economic gain, and for social and political reasons, and therefore slavery does not die out, does not drift away. So the question of what will happen with territories in the West, especially the Louisiana Purchase territory, the question of what will happen with these territories is something which maybe the founding fathers' generation did not think they would have to deal with. When Jefferson purchases Louisiana from France in 1803, he doesn't really think about that territory as being territory that would be inhabited by slaves, because Jefferson felt there had been kind of an agreement, a kind of strict interpretation of the Constitution based on the kind of egalitarian principles of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence would mean that there would not be really any desire or great will to move slaves into this Louisiana Purchase territory. Jefferson, like many others, was naive to think that that would be the case. And the first time in American history where a real sense that the country has become divided along sectional lines between North and South, slave and free, is in 1819 into 1820, culminating in this Missouri Compromise of 1820, which I'm going to talk about very briefly now. This is something that you have to understand for the next topic we're going to look at, because the Missouri Compromise line does provide compromise. It provides compromise for roughly 34 years. Something happens in the 1850s which will bring an end to the Missouri Compromise. Once the Missouri Compromise is gone, then the road to the Civil War looks kind of much more likely. So we'll have to kind of refer back to the Missouri Compromise in the next lecture, but let's find out what we mean by it. Right, to keep things simple, it always worked out well for the United States if there was the same amount of southern states as there were northern states, or to rephrase, free states and slave states, because this meant there was a balance of power within the Senate, and therefore crucial decisions about slavery were, less likely to be easily passed from a slave state position, or anti-slavery views were less likely to pass based on the fact that we had this kind of equilibrium. However, in 1819, Missouri has become a territory, not a state, a territory that has got enough residents living within it, 60,000, where it can request to become a state. So it's going to move from a territorial position to an actual state. And it had been a state that had been growing, a territory, sorry, that had been growing since really the early 1800s, because it's kind of directly above Louisiana, and Louisiana had become an American state in 1812. So there had been migration north to this territory of Missouri. Now, if Missouri wants to become a state, and a slave state at that, how would the American Congress respond? Well, the House of Representatives in 1819 votes against Missouri becoming a state, and this is pretty obvious as to why this was the outcome, because there are more northern House of Representative members than there are south, and that's because of the nature of the American political system. The amount of representatives you have per state is based on the population of the states, and because there was a higher population in the north than there was in the south, and also this will just expand and expand where the north increases its population size over the next 40 years. Because of this advantage, if you like, to the north, it means that this cannot even get past the House, let alone get to the Senate. Why is there a compromise? Why is it eventually allowed for Missouri to become a state? Why do the North submit? Well, because there was a desire to keep the parity between the states, and to bring not just Missouri into the Union, but also Maine. I'll come back to this in a second. I just want to show you a source very quickly. This is the Missouri Compromise source here, and basically what happens was it goes to the House. They eventually agree that if Maine can become a state carved out of a little part of this kind of upper New England part of the country, if Maine can become a state, then there's less of an issue with Missouri becoming a state. But it does state here that Missouri is becoming a state above this line in the country known as latitude 3630, right, which you see here, which is technically above, Missouri becomes a slave state in an area which is to some extent deemed to be the North. So in that little extract, this was the kind of final time where a slave state could exist above this territory, above this line. Kentucky and Virginia and Delaware and Maryland, they were all older states, and therefore they could be above this line. But any new states would have to be below this line. That's why Texas, when it does become an American state in 1845, has no problem becoming a slave state because it is very much below this 1820 Missouri Compromise line. You can see Maine up here, carved out of New Hampshire and Massachusetts. And this was a compromise that most sides were fairly happy with. But something does stand out here, and that what basically stands out is that the country does appear to be kind of divided now. So although there were celebrations in March of 1820, the country does seem to be divided over this issue of slave state or free state. And would that disappear anytime soon? Well, not really. I mean, there's a little lull in the proceedings. There's not a new state until 1836, and that's carved out of this Arkansas territory here, state of Arkansas. That obviously shifts the balance again. Do the North complain about this? Not so much on this occasion, but once we get beyond into the 1840s, there's going to be debates again about the kind of fairness of representation within the Senate. Okay, there's another little map here, and I'm going to talk about this in a second. This is the next major issue within United States history regarding slavery and westward expansion, and it's known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is the territory that was taken from Mexico after the 1846 to 1848 Mexican-American War. Now, you can see in source 2, right, which is here. You can read about this in your own time. The kind of terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. America really takes advantage of Mexico's weaknesses during this point in history, and Mexico had kind of gained its independence not that much earlier actually from Spain, but Mexico's northern territories were sparsely populated, and therefore American influence, or what would become American influence, was always a problem for them. Between 1820 right up until the outbreak of war in 1860, America takes 55% of the Mexican territory. It's quite a remarkable amount of what was Mexico now being the United States. And here you see the largest part of it. You can see Texas down in the corner. That becomes an American state before all of these territories here will. But then you've got New Mexico, you've got what is now Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and this major prize here, California, all taken from Mexico. Now, the yellow shaded areas are what Mexico has to cede to the United States in 1848 after this defeat during the Mexican War. And there is another, therefore, major issue that the American government, American people will have to deal with, which is what's going to happen to all this territory. There had already been this potential for secession from southern states, some southern states, over the Missouri Compromise crisis. What would be the response to these new territories that are available within the West, the far West? Would there just be an extension of the Missouri Compromise line, or would that be too problematic? Would it be pointless in some respects, because in the southern part of California, right, so the area below 36 and 30 latitude, there weren't any slaveholders and slaves, right? Slaveholders and slaves hadn't bothered to go to this part of the world. It wasn't practical for many of them. So what would be the point of extending the line here when the entire state of California does not really want to have anything to do with slavery? Now, the war doesn't end until 1848, but before we even get to 1848, the Wilmot Proviso issued by Democratic Congressman David Wilmot, tries to preempt what should happen with territory that would be taken from Mexico when the war was over. Obviously, the Americans are convinced they're going to win this war fairly easily, which they do, right? And they eventually even occupy Mexico City, the capital of Mexico. The 1846 to 1848 Mexican War is sometimes seen by historians, or is often seen by historians, as being a long-term factor explaining the Civil War. And that is because how politicians react to this victory. If America had defeated Mexico and not taken any territory, then perhaps the Civil War might not have come when it did, or maybe not at all. But the reason that America is at war with Mexico in the first place is for territorial acquisitions. The American president at this time is a guy called President James Polk, and Polk is, I guess, a kind of aggressive expansionist, and he wants territory. He wants territory to eventually kind of complete the United States by America now going from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And to some extent, that also kind of been Thomas Jefferson's wish with the Louisiana Purchase. So Polk is not going to war with Mexico for any kind of noble reason. War with Mexico is about territory, and people know it, and Wilmot knows it, and the Wilmot Proviso that is put to Congress knows it, because he states within it, as I said even before the war is over, that territory that comes from the Republic of Mexico must, once it's negotiated, once it is sorted, once territory has been paid for, should neither have slavery nor involuntary servitude exist within it, except for crime whereof the parties shall first be duly convicted. Now this passes the US House of Representatives twice, and it looks like there is a desire within the North, therefore, for the territory, especially the territory of California, to become a free state. But because in the Senate at this point, and we should always be clear on this, there is a slight advantage for the South at the initial stages here, because there's extra slave states in the Union, so they can vote it down. They can stop the Wilmot Proviso becoming law. Why would any Southerners vote for such a proviso? Wilmot, I should say, right, he's not making this point that these territories taken from Mexico should be free from slavery because of his love of black people, for his love of equality and fairness. He just doesn't want black people anywhere near California. In the same way that Oregon in the same period, 1840s, 50s, bans not just slaves but black people in general from their territory, is because there's a kind of racist element among some Northerners. And Wilmot makes this clear. He states the Negro race already occupy enough of this fair continent. He's talking obviously about the South, and therefore what he wants is westward expansion, but westward expansion for white, hard-working men, farmers, who can go to, whether it be Oregon or in this case California, and live without, in his word, disgrace, which association with Negro labour, i.e. slave labour, brings upon free labour. So Wilmot is no friend necessarily of black people. He is just anti-Southern. In fact, he's a Democrat who kind of resents the fact that the Southern segment of the Democratic Party dominates at this point. Polk is very much in the position where he's kind of influenced by Southerners. So this Wilmot Proviso will become a rallying cry for the North, really from this point right through until the outbreak of the Civil War. The response to the Wilmot Proviso comes from the South, right, and the individual who's responsible for the kind of response to what Wilmot was suggesting is John C. Calhoun, and he makes clear his view, which represents the South, in what has come to be known as the Calhoun Doctrine of 1847, sometimes also referred to as a kind of address to the Southerners, or the Southern Platform. Therefore, we have got two contrasting positions about what should happen in the new territories acquired from Mexico: the Wilmot Proviso and Calhoun's position. Calhoun's position was that slaveholders in the United States were entitled to take their property to whichever territories they wished, because territories were not governed by the president, not by the executive, not by the House, not by the Senate, but by the states, because the 10th Amendment, which was basically an amendment to the Constitution right at the beginning of the birth of the United States, states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Because the Constitution didn't really say anything about territorial expansion, because it wasn't something directly granting powers to the federal government, then the states basically believed, and did, to call it the 10th Amendment, have the ability to decide what happens to new territories coming into the nation. That kind of complex constitutional argument. But the point is, Southerners really believed this, and Kilqueen therefore felt that slave owners were free to go wherever they wished, until the Constitution said that they could not, or federal law said that they could not. There was a third view, so you've got the two polar opposites, Calhoun and Wilmot, and then you have an attempt to bring some type of compromise to things in 1848. This idea is known as popular sovereignty, and it was an attempt to compromise by some Whigs and some Democrats. The two political parties at this point, I should say, are Democrats and the Whigs. Neither of them are sectional. You get Southern Whigs and Northern Whigs, and you get Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats. So obviously that will change over the next 10 years. What did this include? Well, popular sovereignty was really a view that the settlers should decide. So once you've got your 60,000 people living within the territory, and there's a desire for statehood, have a vote, and whatever the majority of that 60,000, or maybe slightly more, if you allow more people to come in during the process of voting, they decide, they determine if a state is free or not. Now, sounds like a great idea, sounds inherently democratic. There are some problems. The main one being, what about corruption? Because who really is a member of this territory? People could come into the territory, say they're living there, and leave. And this is what we will see when popular sovereignty is implemented in the 1850s. You get, in Kansas, local slave owners and pro-Southerners from Missouri nipping into Kansas voting, and then going back to Missouri. This gave Southerners an advantage when the vote comes round. So there are problems with this potential solution. The most obvious solution, I've already mentioned, the extension of the Missouri Compromise line, not deemed acceptable to Northerners or Southerners on the extremes of their kind of sections, because Northerners don't want any slavery in the West, and Southerners believe that they should not just be contained to below latitude 3630, or just below the Missouri Compromise line. There was the odd politician during this period who believed that when Mexico was defeated, there should be no territorial acquisitions because of the problems that would be stirred up if that was to be the case. One of these politicians was Abraham Lincoln, who at this point was a congressman, and Lincoln felt, well, let's just not take anything from Mexico, it will cause more problems than it's worth. I should say, back in 1820, when the Missouri Compromise line was established, the former president, the kind of great statesman by this point of American society, Thomas Jefferson says about the Missouri Compromise, he said, like a fire bell in the night, it filled me with terror. I considered it to be the knell of the Union. It is hushed for the moment, but this is a reprieve only, a geographical line basically coinciding with this kind of marked principle, slavery or not slavery. Once that was conceived and held up to kind of angry men, then it will never be obliterated. And Lincoln is of a similar view. Why cause problems in 1848 that you don't have to cause? Why make life difficult for the country? Why split it further over the issue of slavery expansion? But as I said before, that was never the intention of Polk. War in Mexico was war for territory. America is acting as an imperialist nation at this point. It's basically taking land from other countries. Even if America did pay Mexico for some of this land, it was whilst also putting a gun to the head of the Mexicans. So all of these issues, all these problems, are problems for not James K. Polk, because Polk decides wisely to not run for election in 1848. He's only in power for 4 years, Polk, right? But my God, what he does is he loads the next generation with a burden of problems. He, I guess, for American patriots and American nationalists, he would go down as a rather remarkable politician, because during his time in office, he brings the Mexican territory into the Union through the Mexican War, and he also admits Texas as a slave state. So he is responsible for increasing the kind of population and size of America in a way that only Thomas Jefferson had done with the 1803 Louisiana Purchase. So Polk's out the picture. Therefore, the elections of 1848 are going to elect someone who is going to have to deal with these problems of the Wilmot Proviso, the Calhoun Doctrine. And there are three political parties, for the first time really kind of three distinguishable political parties at this 1848 election, which is unusual, I guess, in American history nowadays, but during the 1800s this was much more common. The Whig Party and the Democrat Party, and then a new party called the Free Soil Party, who will eventually become a party that you are familiar with, the Republican Party. The Republican Party of the 19th century. The 19th century is rather different than maybe the Republican Party of the present day. So, what's going to happen at this election? There are, as I said, three parties, but only two really have got a chance of winning this. Here you've got the three candidates. You've got Lewis Cass representing the Democrats, who's a kind of moderate, safe candidate. In the middle you've got Zachary Taylor, former war hero during the Mexican War, who was the Whig candidate. And then finally you've got the Free Soil Party, and their candidate is an old Democrat, a guy called Martin Van Buren. So the way things work out, you know the American system does not really care too much about the popular vote. The popular vote is won by the Whigs, by Zachary Taylor, but what's really important is the Electoral College vote, and the Electoral College vote goes the way of, very slowly these figures will emerge, goes the way of Taylor and the Whigs. The Free Soil Party receives 0 Electoral College votes. So this is a victory for the Whig Party, a Whig for Taylor. Taylor was incidentally a southern slave owner, and you might think at first that this is a good deal for the South, but that will not necessarily transpire. So the victor is the Whigs and Zachary Taylor. He has got his job cut out in shaping the future of the country post-Mexican War. Here is the little election map where you can see that the country, just at this point it's important to me to note this, the country isn't divided along sectional lines. You've got purple states representing the Whigs, and you've got this kind of reddy colour representing the Democrats, and you can see the Democrats do well in Alabama and they do well in Maine, and the Whigs do well in New York State and the Whigs do well in Florida. So north and south here is not an issue. There is no divide at this point based on political parties, but that's all going to change in the next 12 years or so. So after the 1848 election, the deep divisions in American political life really become evident. The question is, how is Taylor's Whig administration going to deal and address these problems? Both major parties, in spite of what I've just shown you, are not going to be able to hold on to these kind of votes coming from both the North and the South. At some point the parties are going to have to take a position. Are they in favour of slavery expanding, or are they opposed to slavery expanding? Sitting on the fence does not really work at this point in American history, hence why we will have this new political party that was a sectional party, the Republican Party, appear very soon after. So the third source that I've included comes from the historian Alan Farmer, and it's quite a good little summary of where America is at as the new president and the new Congress meets in 1848. And when they meet in 1848, they have got a whole range of things that they have to deal with, made more complicated by the fact that the gold rush is underway by this point. The 49ers in the following year are going to be migrating from east to west in great number, which means that the territory just taken from Mexico, California, where the gold rush happens, is going to have a fairly large population, and this fairly large population can obviously therefore claim for statehood. So that is a major development at this point. So let's look at Taylor and what type of president he was going to be. As I mentioned, he was a Southerner, he did own slaves, but he was anti-slavery expansion. Again, quite similar to what we'll see with Abraham Lincoln. I just want to very quickly read a bit from Source 4, which you can see here, which is a classic book, Battle Cry of Freedom, by the historian James McPherson. And McPherson describes Taylor in the way that Southerners described Taylor at the time. He was a free soil wolf in the clothing of a states' right sheep. Like a good military commander, Taylor planned to break the slavery stalemate by a flank attack to bypass the territorial stage and admit California and also possibly New Mexico as states. Now, if New Mexico, which was a very small new territory that had been taken from Mexico, was actually anti-slavery within this region. We should always bear in mind that slavery had already been abolished in Mexico, so the territories that are taken from Mexico are often anti-slavery as well. California has no desire to be a slave state either, and Taylor's kind of keen in pushing these states through quickly, and he thinks that if you can do it without going through the kind of long drawn out process of how to become a state, he believes that you can actually avoid some of the pitfalls and problems that, you know, things could get bogged down in Congress trying to decide if they should be states or not. A few lines down further, it says California and New Mexico would tip the Senate balance against the South, and for the first time, Senator Jefferson Davis, an important figure, he will become the President of the American Confederacy. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi says we are about to permanently destroy the balance of power between the sections. This was nothing less than a plan of concealing the Wilmot Proviso under a so-called state constitution. There's some truth in that. This would basically give Wilmot and his followers what they wanted. It raised a point of honour according to other Southern Democrats who vowed never to consent to be thus degraded and enslaved by such a monstrous trick and injustice. So Taylor is really loathed by Southerners who think that he's trying to use his position as president to allow the admittance of more free states. I should say what Davis says is not true, right? There had been more slave states than there had been free states up until 1846, because Texas in 1845 and Florida in 1845 had tipped the balance then. But that had not bothered Southerners. In October of 1849, California approved the Free State Constitution and in November elected a Free State governor, and California wants to become a state, a free state. And really there's very little the South could stop to stop this from happening. The New Mexico question is more complicated because a big chunk of New Mexican territory was contested, and Texas believed that they should control part of this boundary. Texas is a slave state, New Mexico wants to become a free state, so that's an issue that's going to have to be addressed. Okay, so Taylor is happy to get things moving, and here you can see the parity is reached with Wisconsin and Iowa in 1846. We have 50 each, but if New Mexico and California become free states, then it's 1715, and that upsets Southerners that the balance in the Senate is no longer what it was. And Southerners already believed, if you read the words of Calhoun, that I'll get to in a second, Southerners already believed that they were the inferior, weaker party in this north-south kind of country, and therefore they were not keen on becoming a section that has less representation in the Senate, because therefore their way of life could be forever under threat. So all of these things are going to be dealt with by the 1850 Congress. Remember, back in the 19th century, the Congress House and the Senate did not sit in the way that it does now because of issues of transportation and remote locations, so it would sit a couple of times a year. So when it comes to sit at this point in 1850, the main issue, the one issue, is how would the country deal with this clear divide over territorial acquisitions? How could this deadlock be resolved over what to do with Mexico or Mexican territory more than anything else? So we get this 1850 Congress, and what is the outcome of this 1850 Congress is often known as the 1850 Compromise. Some of the figures involved in the 1820 Missouri Compromise, such as Henry Clay, are also significant players in the 1850 Compromise. Here is what Henry Clay, this kind of leading Whig politician, senior politician within the Senate, what he puts forward as a way of compromise, and he calls this the Omnibus Bill. This bill, together with these 8 different parts, would have something in it for the South and something in it for the North. Now, you can probably quickly work out what these are, right? California, Free State, pro-North. Organise the remainder of the Southwest without restriction to slavery. That seems pro-South. There's a potential for slavery in maybe parts of what is Utah, Arizona nowadays. Number 3, deny Texas its extreme claim to a Rio Grande boundary, i.e. give New Mexico the territory that it believes is theirs, and this would make Texas smaller. That's pro-northern, if you like. But compensate Texas by assuming its debts. Texas was about $10 million in debt to the federal government over the period when it kind of becomes a state. So, pro-South. Uphold slavery in the District of Columbia. Now that was definitely seen as being pro-Southern, because many Northerners were offended by the fact that in the country's capital, visiting ambassadors and statesmen could see slaves being sold on the blocks in Washington DC. So that's pro-Southern element of this bill. But number 6 says abolish the slave trade across its boundaries. So, bit of a compromise here. You can keep slavery in Columbia, but you couldn't allow slaves to be bought and sold in the state of, or the area of the District of Columbia. So slightly complicated, but that's more pro-North, that part. Adopt a more effective Fugitive Slave Act, definitely pro-South. Major issue that we'll deal with in the next online lecture. And then number 8, deny congressional authority to interfere with interstate slaves. So southern states can trade all they want in whatever way they want. That's another pro-southern element. Clay believed that this would be compromise. This would bring compromise. That Americans in the Senate would see sense, irrespective if you came from Massachusetts or Georgia, you would see sense that the unity of the country was more important. That the talk of secession, now I should make this clear, in 1831, 1832 there had already been talk of secession, and what I mean by secession is the threat that southern states, some southern states, or any state technically, but southern states might decide to leave the Union. Now there's a major question here if that is even possible. Was that legal to leave the Union? But taking the legal argument aside, South Carolina, upset with a federal tariff law in the 1830s, had already threatened to leave the Union. The only reason it might not have done so is because it didn't have the support of any other southern states. So she backed down and accepted her fate. But secession was a threat often thrown about by southern politicians. Henry Clay, in his attempt to obviously ensure that none of this could even be contemplated, talks about the importance of the Union coming together. And he says, if the Union is to be dissolved for any existing causes, he says it will be dissolved because slavery is threatened to be abolished in places like DC, or because fugitive slaves are not being returned. So what he's saying is an appeal to the North. Just give the South these things which are technically already their constitutional rights, because there was a fugitive slave law written in the Constitution. Give them what they want, just make them feel wanted, make them feel reassured, and then the Union can continue happily. Northerners were therefore really being asked to accept elements of slavery. Some Northerners don't really care about slavery, happy for things to continue, but there's a growing voice of anti-slavery opinion, especially anti-slavery expansion within the North amongst abolitionists and amongst some politicians. So Clay's calls for compromise fall on deaf ears for Northerners. There was another Northerner by the name of Daniel Webster, who you can see here, who also he was from Massachusetts, and he says famously, I'm not here as a Massachusetts man, I'm here as an American, and I'm making my appeal to Northerners to accept this bill proposed by Clay because it will guarantee some type of unity. As that is going on, you have John Calhoun, the Southerner, looking kind of rather scary in this picture, also demanding that the bill be passed because he thinks there's some benefit to the South in it. And Calhoun, I'm not going to read through all of this, you can read it your own time. Calhoun really is of the view that it's time for the North to stop interfering in the issue of slavery. It's nothing, in his view, to do with them. It's white people in the South who have to live with black slaves, therefore they should be allowed to deal with this social relationship in whatever way is best suited to them. And he says, can the Union be saved? Yes, it can, but only if the North allows it to do so, because they are the stronger of the two sections. He concludes by saying the North only has to will it to accomplish it. And therefore, there's a lot of pressure being put on Northern politicians to accept this compromise. Do they adhere to these claims? Well, no they don't. Clay's proposals are not accepted. The Senate just cannot bring itself, Northern senators cannot bring itself to accept them. Part of the issue here is President Zachary Taylor does not accept the bill. He is already deciding that California is going to become a free state. He's already deciding that New Mexico is going to be a free state. The compromise doesn't even allow for New Mexico to become a free state. That was the part of it which said, well, we'll see what happens. That was really this idea of popular sovereignty. Taylor is not a fan of popular sovereignty. He likes the idea of himself having the power to determine who's going to be a state and who isn't. So it looked like there had been a logjam. How were American politicians going to overcome this lack of desire for compromise? Well, Taylor dies right in the middle of debates about the 1850 compromise. Henry Clay loses the vote. He goes home back to his state of Kentucky. He is of the view that the success of the compromise of 1820 is not going to be achieved in 1850. But when Taylor dies, it opens up a new opportunity because the president who replaces him, the vice president, Millard Fillmore, is a Northerner, doesn't own slaves, but weirdly is the opposite of Taylor in that he's more pro-South. And therefore Fillmore, who is influenced by Clay and Webster, he decides that he's going to back the bill, and his attempts to back the bill might push some Whigs who were less clear on their views or positions to support it. However, it fails. The Omnibus Bill fails because of Northern senators claiming that they were unwilling to compromise. This is a key phrase that we're going to hear more of in the next lecture. Unwillingness to compromise with the slave power. This was the idea that somehow Southerners controlled all the main institutions within the United States. The Supreme Court and now the presidency appeared to be being influenced by the slave power, which meant that Clay was kind of defeated. In stepped Stephen Douglas, and Douglas came up with a pretty ingenious solution. Rather than having one big bill to put back to Congress that they probably would throw out again, split the bill into different parts. And when you split it into different parts, pro-North, pro-South, then obviously Northerners are going to vote in favour of the pro-North bits, Southerners are going to vote in favour of the pro-South bits. But to make sure that these bills could be passed with a majority, you had to work on moderates. And that is what Douglas felt he could do. Douglas was a Northern Democrat. He believes if you could just get a few moderates on each side to support these bills, then that might be enough to see them through. But it was another trick that really ensures the 1850 compromise and all these different parts of the bill are put through. And it's to do with Texas. Texas, as I mentioned, was $10 million in debt. If the part of the bill granted that Texas should not be allowed to expand its boundary, and Texas accepted this $10 million, then, well, accepted their debt would be cleared off, then that would be two kind of proposals that are pro-South. How would you get Northerners to vote for that? Well, some Northern politicians, Northern senators, had invested money in the debt that Texas had. For them to make their money back, right, to gain the interest on this loan that had been given to Texas, and for them to make money in the form of bonds being cashed in, they needed the deal to go through. So in some weird ways, what pushes the 1850 Compromise through is good old-fashioned, not so much bribery, but convincing that you'll make lots of money. Individual senators can make money by the passage of those parts of the bill. So that's sometimes all it took, just to kind of push some moderate Northerners to voting for Southern parts of the deal, and some moderate Southerners, especially those in the kind of border states, to vote for kind of northern parts. Was the 1850 Compromise, which had all been passed and wrapped up by 1850, was it a success? Had the country truly united, or was this just a postponement of hostilities? Well, source 7, again from the historian Alan Farmer. Farmer quotes another historian, David Potter, and Potter says this was not a success, this was an armistice. The historian Holman, who you can read about on My City, Holman says, this was an event that was really truly celebrated in the capital in 1850. There were fireworks and people getting incredibly drunk. In fact, Holman even writes about the kind of hangovers that existed in Washington the next day. So a real celebration amongst the people and the politicians. But when you started to look at what had happened, had really anything been achieved? Because if the 1850 Compromise was kind of forced upon the majority of the more extreme elements, then would they actually accept all of the terms of the 1850 Compromise? Would there be really not another issue that could stir up really quickly? What happens when the first group of Southerners want to take their slaves into these territories? What would happen when popular sovereignty actually had to become a practical idea and put into practice? What about when northern states are forced to send back slaves who have escaped? Lots of questions really remained unanswered. So the compromise, as Potter says, had skirted rather than settled the controversy of slavery in the territories. So we're left with this map, last slide, the Compromise of 1850. We can see that California is now a free state. We can see that the other two large territories, the New Mexican Territory and the Utah Territory, are undecided. They're going to be split up at some point into smaller territories / states. But at this point there's no need to worry about that. But with more and more people moving into New Mexico, then there's going to have to be a vote, and popular sovereignty is the method that's been decided upon here. The 1820 Compromise line still exists, so there is some view that this is going to contain the spread of slavery. Weirdly, as we will see in our next online lecture, the problems don't emerge actually in the Mexican territory, but we go back to the Louisiana Purchase territory. The next territories that want to become states are in Kansas and Nebraska, especially Kansas, and that is going to be the next place in the United States where we're going to see a kind of mini conflict emerge, a mini version of what will become the Civil War in 1861, and that's part of our next story. But for now, we have dealt with the 1850 Compromise. I want you to think about this as being the kind of long-term context for the causes of the Civil War, which we will begin with from 1850 through to 1861 in the next lesson. Thank you.